Terzo intervento introduttivo, chiamo il dottor Kaschl della European Commission, della Commissione Europea. Please.
Grazie. Good morning to everybody, and it's great to see how enthusiastic the people are about refrigeration, that you show up here so early on a Saturday and a beautiful day in Milan. Thanks for having me. Thanks for Marco for organizing this. Already it's been a very interesting discussions yesterday, very interesting conference. So we're off to a very good start, and I think that fits in very neatly with the interesting times that we're living in, they're experiencing for this sector also. And not least, of course, from my subjective vantage point, maybe I'm thinking of the proposal that the European Commission has made last year. And of course, I'm from the Directorate General of Climate Change, so emission reduction is one big objective, but another big objective is, of course, also driving innovation. So it might be good to hear from you what you think about that in the ensuing discussion. I started not too long ago in this subject, and one of the first tasks I was involved in was a stakeholder survey that we did, and one of the messages coming out clearly from there is that industry not only didn't want us to just do a unilateral approach, they wanted us to also take this to a higher level. And I'm proud to say that we are trying to follow up on that request. And we can see that HFCs are getting to the agenda more and more, also in the climate discussions. It was in Doha already mentioned at the margins. We also had in the high-level segments a number of high-level ministers speaking about it. And this has now very much gone into the so-called ADP Workstream 2, meaning advancing the Durban platform and talking in particular about the pre-2020 ambition. You know that there is the plan in 2015 to come up with a new climate agreement that would supposed to work from 2020 onwards. But as we know, there is a certain emissions gap to what we should be doing in order to stay within the 2 degrees that we'd like to achieve. And that's called the emissions gap. And there we need also until 2020 some actions. And HFCs is one of the front runners in this discussion where we could be doing something quickly at a relative moderate cost. So it is quite, at the moment in Bonn, we have the conference, UNFCCC conference going on, and it is very much on the agenda. And I can also say that the EU has made a submission to the ADP on phasing down HFCs, and that should be done under the Montreal Protocol, because we believe that's the best mechanism to do it, which does not preclude that emissions would be addressed, of course, under the UNFCCC, as they're already done. And just this Monday, we're having in Bonn a side event on this issue, and we'll be trying to spread that message more. So I think there is a lot of movement at the moment. We'll see, of course, Montreal is only coming later this year. We'll see how that then also can be picked up in the Montreal Protocol discussions at some point. Jim mentioned that the ozone job is not yet done, that many developing countries are only starting now to phase out the HCFCs. And while on one hand we think that developed countries who are using HFCs should do something about this, we also think that there's an opportunity in where HFCs, high GWP HFCs have not yet phased in, that we could avoid this step and go directly to more climate-friendly alternatives directly. That would be very cost-efficient in the long run. So, as I said, it is interesting times that we live in. It particularly concerns, of course, your sector. And I think that will also be then the fertile ground for some interesting discussions that we should be having now. Thank you.
Kaschl della European Commission, che abbiamo già imparato a conoscere precedentemente. Please, 12 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Hello again. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the proposal that the European Commission made last November. And since we've seen a lot of thermodynamic diagrams, and for me as a simple policymaker, something like this is easier to understand. And this is the Venice of Germany. It's a city called Passau in southeastern Bavaria. It's a picture taken just earlier this week. And even though it looks very beautiful in this way, these houses are not supposed to be standing in the water. So, of course, we've had some very recent floods in Germany just this week. And there is a certain relation to climate change. Of course, there's a science of attribution, they call it, in how much can we attribute certain events to the effect of climate change, and how much is it just the statistical occurrence of such events. So, IPCC is one thing, and this is, I think, another thing. This is quite hard data. This is from one of the biggest reinsurance firms in the world, Munich Re, Münchner Rückversicherung. And of course, for their business model, it's very important to see how these catastrophic events that they insure against, what their frequency is. And you see here different types: meteorological events, hydrological events, climatological events. Very dramatic one. And they see, and this is data for the past, and that's what's very important. It's nothing a prognostic to the future. It's not a climate model with all uncertainties involved. This is data from the past years, from 1980 to 2010. And of course, there is a certain variability, but overall, they see a clear trend. And of course, they are worried about this. And this is a little bit what climate change is all about, that these extreme events will become more frequent. So, what is, on our policy level, what do we want to do about it? Oops, I jumped forward too quickly. This is the so-called low emission roadmap going towards 2050. And you see there's a number of sectors, and all of them, in the end, have to contribute. You see this red line on top is a little bit where we are steering with current policy measures, and we end up at 60% of today by 2050. If we want to reach the 2% target, we would have to do a lot more. We would have to go to at least 80 to 95% reduction in 2050. And that's more or less the line when you follow the addition of all the different colors, so it's the upper blue one. You also find in the lowest one this blue sector, which is called non-CO2 other sectors. This is the one where the F-gas sector sits in. And you see also this sector has to pay its contribution, basically. And we've calculated what this would mean for the sector, and it means the 70 million tons of CO2, less than what we have today of emissions. So we come to that. Here, you see the upper dotted line. That's a little bit what would have happened if we hadn't taken action already in Europe. We would have grown from emissions of about 110, 120,000 in 2010 to over 200,000 in 2050. With the legislation we have in place, which is especially the F-gas regulation and the MAC directive, we will be able to stabilize this. So it's quite some savings that can be done. Of course, it implies that we implement well, and we are making good progress, but we're still not there. So there is a little bit still for us work to do all together, from our level all the way down to, in the field, the service personnel and the manufacturers. What we've seen is also, by a long process with stakeholders, with the industry that started by my predecessors in 2010, that there is additional potential. And this is the lower line going down. And for this sector, actually, we can reach the 70 million CO2 reduction in 2030 if we reap that potential fully. We have seen also in our studies leading up to the proposal that if we just do containment and maybe enlarge the scope a little bit, and there isn't so much more scope because we are doing a lot of areas already, we're covering a lot, we don't get so much more, so that wouldn't be enough. But a little bit, it's a bit of a change also from the existing, that avoiding the use would get us there. Of course, we had some bands already in the existing proposal, but these were more in some smaller defined areas, and now, of course, we're moving this to a more larger approach of avoiding the use. So, principles of our proposal is we fully maintain what we've had so far. It's been, in some member states, as they tell us, a very painful process. And just now we are able to close basically the last open files on this one. So now we have more or less over Europe people being certified, leak checking taking place. So we have established quite a lot, and that of course we want to maintain because it is yielding benefits. But we're also introducing some new prohibitions, and most of all we're introducing a phase down of HFCs, of the demand of HFCs. So I've picked up a number of changes that might be more interesting to the refrigeration sector and also to some of the session priorities that we have. So on unnecessary emissions, on venting, we're a little bit more explicit in the text. And we also include now the people who do installation, maintenance, and decommissioning. Before it was mostly on the operators. Similarly, for the certification, we now, at least it was the intention of the Commission proposal, to cover all activities on the mobile air conditioning equipment. In the current regulation, we have only the recovery, but for instance, for a person who does the recovery for an air conditioner in a car, he would be probably, in most cases, be the same person who does the maintenance. So it doesn't really, to us, it's not logical why one should require certification and the other shouldn't. We also intend to extend the scope somewhat of the leaking checks, and we propose to include the refrigerated trucks and trailers, because there we saw it was both cost efficient and both also yielding a sufficient amount of emissions. And we've also changed to the use of CO2 weighted thresholds throughout, and one area where it applies to is, for instance, the leak checks, meaning an equipment with a high GWP would have to be checked probably more frequently than one that uses a lower GWP refrigerant, which to us seems logical. Further, the record keeping is extended in line with the scope extension on the leak checking. One thing that also we think is important is that the emissions data, which is being collected at company levels today, because companies have to keep records of when their systems are being maintained, when they are being serviced. But it's not, this data is lying around, and we think it would make sense to bring this to the national level and then also improve our knowledge on what actual leakage rates in the field are. To the extension of recovery, well, it was in the old regulation. There are limits such as costs and other exemption, well, ways that limit the application here. So we've been on the wording a little bit more inclusive here. And we also, one important point, the training, which we would like from the Commission side to also, or at least the certification to cover alternative technologies, because of course their use will become more frequent. Those are a little bit the changes on the more technical issues. Now, one of the major points, the bans and the phase down. On the bans, we of course don't take any of the bans back that we already have, but on we have a flexibility clause also in there in the Commission proposal that we could include more or leave out others. And we have exemptions based on the eco-design requirements. And of course, that's a little bit to the discussions we've had this morning on the energy efficiency. And I'd just like to make a comment here that Paul made a very good comment that it's very difficult on the energy efficiency to get 1%, 2%. So that's exactly a bit our point. We want to do on the, EPA always points out, the direct emissions is only 5%, maybe 10%, and some equipment 15%. But if we can go from a high GWP to a low or almost no GWP refrigerant, we take this 5-10% in one go. As long as we don't lose energy efficiency. So our promise was, as long as an alternative is safe and energy efficient, then of course we get an immediate benefit of switching to the low GWP refrigerant. And that was a bit the approach. Of course, we have the eco-design policy alongside, and we're seeking to have the synergies. And this clause here is exactly the synergy where we try to see, look, okay, in this case, maybe really we would lose in energy efficiency. Maybe we could then make an exemption here. So that's the idea behind this. On bans, I don't think we need to, in this context, talk about here the non-HFCs. We have a few bans that are so-called signposts, meaning in some areas where it's very easy to, or relatively easy to switch to other alternatives, it might be good to set a final date where they shouldn't be used anymore in order to free up the HFCs under a phase-down regime in other areas where it's more difficult. We have a couple, I come to that also in the next slide. Then there's this animal called the service ban, which has caused a bit of discussion, and we're basically proposing to ban the servicing from 2020 of very high GWP refrigerant using equipment. No, not the equipment itself, but the servicing of it. 2,500 is for us the limit. And this was based on an idea that we didn't have originally on the radar, but it came from an industry study who told us, look, if you go for 4 or 4A, you can make a lot of savings early on, and it will make the phase down easier. And we found that argument persuasive, so we brought it in. We have, of course, in further discussions realized that maybe the original scope may have been a bit ambitious, and this is fully going into discussions with Council and Parliament, so we are at a more or we will surely end up at a more reduced scope, but then we think an early implementation would help the phase down. Okay, well, I'm being told to speed up here. So what other signposts do we have? Well, we have one thing, we need to safeguard that our phase down, that we don't get gases coming inside equipment, and for us the cleanest and easiest solution was to ban the pre-charging of it, either from outside produced equipment or from that equipment produced in the EU. So that's what we proposed. Alongside, for equipment that has a closed circuit, hermetically sealed, we have a number of bans to address these issues, as you see them listed. So the main point is the phase down. You see more or less the schedule proposed, which we think is fully appropriate, and I can comment on this maybe later in the discussion to make it, to wrap this up more quickly. You have probably seen our proposal, what the phase-down steps are. Just to mention, the tail end, 21%, is supposed to cover all the applications where it's difficult today, based on 2010 technologies, to phase out. And that includes, for instance, the medical device inhalers, the MDIs, and heat pumps. And we think it is fully sufficient to cover, for instance, the heat pumps. It's always being raised, because the growth rates assumed were pre-crisis, were from 2007 and 8. In the last years, the growth rates have really gone down a lot. So in the growth rates assumed coming to these needs for 2030, they are much more higher in the model than what we see in reality for the last years. Okay, environment, I mentioned more or less the impact, about 70 million CO2 that we can save. Economic, from our models tell us from plus 0.009% to minus 0.006% would be the impact, so around zero, low. Also on the employment cost, the models differ a little bit, and depending on the approach being used. So we think both social and economic costs are relatively moderate at a very good gain on the environmental side. So to conclude, basically, that's the next approach. We have made our proposal. It's not so much in our hands anymore. It's in the hands of the political players, the Council and the Parliament. They are very actively discussing it. It was mentioned already before that the 19th of June is a very important vote in the ENVI committee, in the Environment Committee in the Parliament. That's not the end of it, of course. Then comes the plenary, and then comes also a little bit the discussion with the Council. So there is a commitment from our players to reach agreement in first reading, meaning later this year, and then we could start in 2014 with a law in place. That is the scenario that we're hoping to reach, and we're also encouraged by industry, for instance, pointing out that that's what they would like to see, not least also for planning security. Yes, I will finish now. I guess we have also mentioned some of these points already on the international context in the previous session, so I'll leave it here, and happy to address any comments, of course, that you might have and questions.
Thank you very much. Abbiamo sentito